This short video describes Chapter 5 in the 5th edition of our book. Some of you have the newer edition, the 6th edition, and now the chapters sort of change a little bit, so this is Chapter 10 out of the new edition of the book. I've copied information from both books, or both chapters, and presented it here. And this short talk now is about the first half of those chapters that really are talking about hypothesis testing. And hypothesis testing, it's really going to depend on the nature of the research. So what kind of problem is trying to be solved, or what kind of question is trying to be answered, and that will really then drive the kind of hypothesis, or actually even if an hypothesis is being used. So a list of different kinds of research, like historical research, descriptive research, qualitative research. We actually in our class have done experimental research, and you've read some experimental research. There's something called action research and epidemiological research. So these are all different research approaches that will drive the kind of hypothesis and actually if an hypothesis is required. I took a picture out of Chapter 5 of the 5th edition of our book, and here's definitions for historical research, history, so it describes what was. Descriptive research is describing what is happening now, understand the conditions that are currently existing. Qualitative research also describes what is, but typically in a non-quantitative information. So, and experimental research is describing what will be. So, for example, we read papers about Nike running shoes. So the Nike running shoes will improve or increase running economy. So experimental research describes what will be. Something that is in the news now is epidemiological research, and it's the study and analysis of the distribution, who, when, where, and the patterns and the determinants of health and disease. And this is going on right now around the world, trying to determine who is being infected by the COVID virus, when that is happening, where that is happening. So that is epidemiological research. So hypotheses, and this is important, and some of the papers you're reading will have an hypothesis. Some may not, and we'll look in and talk about that a little bit now. So it's really important for most research studies. It's a tentative, so it's an idea for the explanation of the outcome of that research problem, or your sort of tentative, your idea of how to answer the research question that was there. In some research, like behavioral sciences, descriptive studies, there may not be a hypothesis. It may be a list of objectives, it may be a purpose statement, and not necessarily an hypothesis. If comparisons are being made, like one group versus another group, then typically there will be an hypothesis. So here's a list out of Chapter 5 of the 5th edition of our textbook, and the same thing is out of the 10th edition. So in general, research hypotheses. So this is your or the researcher's sort of educated guess. We've defined this earlier. They're based on theory. It's not just a guess, it's an educated guess. What do you predict? Theory and previous research, what do you predict is going to happen? And stating the relationship between at least two variables, maybe more, typically more actually. Simple, clear, no vague terms. It's testable. So, so grip strength was significantly greater in males versus females. That's testable, and we did it. They have the credibility of being refuted. and can be evaluated in terms of yes, it occurred, or no, it did not occur. And finally, they're related to available techniques of design, procedures, statistical analysis. And we're not really going to get into that much in this class, but that's important, and we'll do some more hypothesis testing as well. So, types of hypotheses. So the research hypothesis, this is really what the researchers are interested in. And that's the educated guess. That's what they think is going to happen. And it's not just a guess. It's based on theory. It's based on previous research. It's understanding that, yeah, strength is a function of muscle mass. And in general, males have more muscle mass than females. Yeah, of course. And it's a tentative explanation for their results. There's the null hypothesis, and null is the opposite, that there will be no difference or no relationship. And we don't usually think about this null hypothesis, yet it's important for statistical testing. So the hypothesis, which says that the independent variable, remember independent is the one that is being manipulated, it's going to have no effect on the dependent variable. The dependent, D is for data, that's how I remember it. Dependent variable is the one that we're measuring. So the independent variable in our little experiment was males versus females. So we manipulated gender, or we had two different groups of sex. And the dependent variable, the data then, was on grip strength. So the null hypothesis, there would be no difference, and doesn't really reflect the researchers' expectations. Our expectation was, of course, males who are on average larger, who are on average have greater muscle mass, will have significantly greater grip strength. So research hypothesis, null, or statistical hypothesis. The research hypothesis is transformed into a statistical or null, and some you may have seen this where it's H with a little subscript 0. This is done to be able to do statistical tests. And we're trying to find out, are they statistically significant, or is it attributed just to chance? So the results of the statistical test that we'll do, we're either going to accept or reject the null hypothesis. So that's actually what we're trying to, using statistical analysis, what we're trying to determine. And the papers that you're reading, what they are trying to determine. So the purpose of this statistical test is to evaluate the null hypothesis. The null was that there would be no difference between the groups at some level of probability. And you've probably seen these probabilities, and they're abbreviated by a little p. And then they'll have some number after it, like p equals 0.05 or p less than 0.05. And 0.05 is a typical probability value that's done in experimental research, at least. And what that means is that do the values of the dependent variable, so D were for data, right? So that was measuring grip strength. Do the values of the dependent variable differ significantly between males and females, for example, so that the differences would not be attributable to chance, and in this case, occurring more than 5 times in 100. So that's the probability. 0.05 is 5 times out of 100. So are the researchers willing to accept that if it's greater than 5 out of 100, then yes, that's a statistical difference. They're only accepting that it would be attributable to chance 5 times, less than 5 times out of 100. So that's what this means, p less than 0.05. So if the null hypothesis is accepted, then the researcher rejects the research hypothesis and concludes there is no difference between groups, right? So the null means that there's no difference, so if you accept that. Or if the null is rejected, that means there is a difference between the two groups, and you'll accept your research hypothesis. So there's a couple examples out of chapter 5 or out of the new book, chapter 10. It's hypothesized that children taught by teaching level A or teaching method A will perform better than teaching of method B. There's just one example. And this is called a directional hypothesis. So one is better, one is greater, one's an improvement over the other. So when the researcher has a reason to believe a particular relationship or difference exists. Children with high IQ are more easily motivated than children with low IQ. A non-directional hypothesis, when the researcher has no reason to believe a particular relationship or difference exists. So not one group is better than the other group. There may be a difference, but you don't know necessarily, or you're not deciding beforehand what direction that will be. So there is a difference in the motivational levels of children with high IQ versus children with low IQ. Example of the null hypothesis, there will be no difference in reading performance between students being taught by method A versus method B, or teaching method has no effect on reading performance. So that's the null, stating there's no difference between the two groups. So I took this picture and copied it out of chapter 5 of our book, or chapter 10, the same thing. So the research hypothesis, here's another example. Young children who have completed a nutritional education program will have a lower total caloric intake and a lower body mass than those children who have not received nutritional education program. So you're predicting that it's directional, that they've completed this nutrition program, and there'll be a difference. The null, then, that there's no difference. So there is no difference in the total caloric intake and body mass, BMI, among young children who have participated in this nutritional education program and those who have not. So research versus null hypothesis. So a rule of thumb, research which asks a difference or a relationship, those kind of questions should have some kind of hypothesis. Research which is describing something, where there's no comparisons across groups, they may not need an hypothesis. It may be it's a descriptive study just trying to describe what is going on with some variable. And the research is trying to reject or fail to reject the null. And then once that is determined, then you can determine if you accept or fail to accept the research hypothesis. And what we've said before is we're not trying to prove something. It's either reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. So this short video was information out of the beginning of chapter 5, out of the 5th edition, the older edition of our research book, or out of chapter 10, out of the 6th edition of our research book. It's the first part of those chapters that are pretty important, talking about hypothesis testing. The second half of the chapter is talking about different data collection tools, mainly with qualitative research, and developing survey techniques and different scales to collect data and collect information. That is also a short video, although I don't think there's audio to that video. So it's just a video of the PowerPoints that you can view. Thank you.